I'm going to kind of talk about this. I know Don's already covered it. This is some of the things we've been working on and kind of made our last year pretty busy as far as new product development happens. So we already talked about the head journey. Obviously, you see it outside as well. But we've also developed a straight bar for large pecans and walnuts as well in there. Brush rake that Don had talked about. This is the very clear picture of it right there. That's the AR500, which is the articulated shuttle. And really, it's a articulated multi-purpose shuttle. So you'll see that picture. I don't know if you can tell really, but that's it pulling a sprayer. So I think it's actually running today as well up north. So, and the next step, kind of some of the stuff Tyler's been working on. The lighting's pretty crap here, but you can see that this is an example of some LiDAR and some of the self-driving technology that he's been working on as well, along with this next screen as well. Kind of shows some LiDAR images and give you an idea how we're able to map and navigate orchards in the future. Lastly, this is kind of what we're doing in the telematics realm. The next screen I'll show you, and we'll dig into that just a little bit more.
Aquí están las cosas de las que estamos hablando hace rato, que están, de las que están trabajando, que están queriendo sacar, que viene siendo el hedger. También tienen el rastrillo para juntar toda la brocha, y el shuttle nuevo que es el AR500, y ese se le puede poner una aspiradora o que sea un tanque. Y también Tyler está trabajando en el sistema viene siendo como GPS para buscar los árboles para las máquinas que no van a ocupar chofer.
All right, next up, this is what we're talking about, telematics. This is kind of hard to see in the screen, probably even harder to see. It's not the handout actually, but so this is telematics we've been installing on some equipment. Actually, every hedger we've made so far has telematics. All our prototypes we put telematics on. Demos we put telematics on. So one, we know where it is, and two, we know what it's been doing. In this particular case, we just talked about the articulated shuttle. And actually, so this is a screenshot from Monday when I put this together. And it was running, had 494 hours on it, and then it can tell you what your fuel rate is and your average depth rate as well. So we're all pretty shocked on that because on that shuttle, it's got a 200 horsepower Cummins in it to make sure it can handle any job. But it's burning, you can see this average rate, about 1.62 gallons per hour. And similar results actually in the hedger when we run it, and as we check the telematics, we're seeing that it averages even at 200 horsepower is less than 3 gallons per hour.
Algo de lo que están ofreciendo las máquinas son el sistema de cómo rastrear la máquina para saber a dónde está y a todo el tiempo y lo que ha hecho. En esa página también te va a decir qué tanto diésel está usando, qué tantas horas tiene la máquina, cuánto ha corrido. Y eso viene en todas las máquinas de hedgers que han hecho, viene eso. Y eso lo estamos haciendo también para saber cuánto diésel va a usar y si tiene algún problema con la máquina.
All right, next up, I'm going to talk about, I put this slide in here for a reason. So John's developing a YouTube channel, and it's actually been fairly handy. It's kind of still in its infancy as it goes. But so as a result of the last year, we didn't do service schools. We were unable to travel, and so some of the international travel that we had normally done wasn't available to us. So actually, about 2 weeks ago, we did a startup. We did our first virtual startup in South Africa. Unfortunately, we're here in California instead of being in South Africa doing this stuff. But so this YouTube channel helped us dramatically because we're able to use some of John's videos, like on how to pre-treat the slings and things like that, so guys could watch the videos and see that. He did a really good job of explaining the shaker as well, so we were able to use those videos to help translate that stuff and then use that in the future. So it's a really handy tool. John's adding more stuff to it all the time. So as slowly as it goes, I'd offer up to you if you have any suggestions for videos as well. Make sure you can DM and actually ask them and say, hey, you guys do a video of this, kind of get that going as well.
Algo más que tenemos es la página de YouTube. En la página de YouTube, John está subiendo muchas cosas de todas las máquinas que tenemos y del cómo el mantenimiento de las máquinas y básico mantenimiento de las máquinas y dice que le está ayudando mucho el canal de YouTube porque ahorita no pueden salir a otros estados, a otros países a hacer entrenamientos, o lo que están haciendo es están usando la página de YouTube, los videos, para enseñarles a cómo el mantenimiento.
All right, so touched on this just a hair bit earlier. So these are the parts and service locations owned and operated by Orchard Machinery. You can see we have the shop in Orland, which is our furthest north. Then we have Yuba City, and then as we go down through the valley, we have Modesto, and then Fireball, Tulare, and Shafter. So on here, this is in your handout as well. It tells you the service manager's name. In this particular case for Yuba City, it's the parts manager south. You know, what you really need to remember is this phone number at the bottom. That's Kevin's phone number.
Aquí está todos los lugares donde tenemos los shops, que viene siendo Orland, la mera mata que es en Yuba City, Tulare, Modesto, Shafter y Fireball. Ahí tiene toda la dirección y el número, y dice que algo importante es el número de Kevin, que está mero abajo.
Thank you, Richard. I don't know why that makes me really good. All right, next up, these are our authorized parts locations. So starting up north again, here we have parts in Chico. So we just recently moved our service center out of Durham, Chico area and moved it kind of on the west side out in Orland. So then, so to kind of make up that space, we put some parts into Chico. We also have Arbuckle up north, and then as we move south, we have Woodland, Linden, and then Madera.
En esta página está todas las locaciones de donde pueden ir a agarrar partes. No son shops, no son servicios, es puras partes. Están en Arbuckle, Chico, Madera, Linden y Woodland.
All right, next up we're going to talk about shaker pads. So, get started on this. We offer two types of them. Anyway, we offer two different types of pads. We do the hollow pads, what we call the oval pads, and then we have our air pads. Right? There's pros and cons to both. There's some maintenance involved, and so over the next few slides, we're going to talk about the differences in those and pros and cons to the advantages.
Vamos a estar hablando de las almohadillas. Hay dos tipos de almohadillas que vienen siendo las sólidas y las que llevan aire. Las sólidas son estas. Estas no llevan nada de aire, no tienen mantenimiento, igual que las almohadillas que llevan nylon y aire.
All right. So as we look at these, this slide is going to show you the difference in the clamping force. So the main advantage here to the air pad is it takes the shape of the tree. As to where the oval pad you'll see in this cutaway is just basically 4 inches of rubber with a hollow spot in the center. So with the beads inside the pad, we're able to take the shape of the tree. Depending on pad fill level, which we'll talk in the next slide about, we can actually make it so it has better contact, even pressure, especially in large trees. We're able to wrap around the tree better and transfer more energy into large trees. But then on the same note, by adding more fill, reducing the clamp pressure, we're able to lightly grab small young trees. So it's adjustable, and it gives us a good grip on small trees and a really firm grip to transfer more power on large trees. There where you see on the oval pads, there's a higher pressure point in the center as it collapses. And then as it goes out through the pad, there's less and less pressure. So higher pressure in the center, and then less and less. So this really comes into play in big trees, where if this one will wrap, transfer more power, then we're going to go through the trouble of trying to shape through what would be the equivalent of 4 inches of rubber on each side.
Una de las ventajas que tenemos son las almohadillas que tienen los balines de plástico y aire por dentro a las que son sólidas, es de que Las que tienen los balines, esas se agarran y abrazan el árbol más mejor. So, tienen más presión alrededor de todo el árbol comparadas a las que son sólidas. So, ya si puedes abrazar todo el árbol completo, puedes mover toda la energía y sacudir el árbol más bien y sin dañarlo, igual que el de las almohadillas sólidas.
All right, here's where we talk about the path, we just kind of talked about that a second ago. So here on this slide, there's a couple, these are some kind of rules of thumb to work with, right? So the amount of fill that's in the pad is going to determine how far the pad can deflect or how far it's going to crush in. So as you clamp the tree, when it's super full, it will only deform and deflect a little bit. So that's what we want for small trees, so we get a good firm. So what we do is adjust the beads, the nylon inside. So these are pellets you see up here, and I really encourage everybody to come by here at some point and look at this display, and you'll see the obvious difference in the pads. But so as we clamp on big trees, we want to reduce the amount of beads in it so the pad can deflect and take the shape of those trees better. And that's all determined by the amount of beads in here. Right. A couple of things to remember. We don't want to overfill the pad. If you fill the pads all the way up or pack the pad, you start packing the beads in there with the rod trying to pack them in there, you're going to make it so firm it won't deflect at all. And you can actually mark trees because the pads are too full. Right? Then we'll talk about the beads inside. The beads that you see here melt at 450 degrees, so they're really expensive. So you need to make sure we're taking care of those. We'll talk about that in the next couple.
Una de las cosas de las almohadillas de aire son el nivel de los balines de plástico que llevan por dentro. Dependiendo del árbol es cuántos balines van a quedar dentro de la almohadilla. So, entre más grande el árbol, va a ser menos balines. So, entre más chico va a ser más balines. Así pueden apretar bien todo. Lo que no quieren es llenarla de más, porque si no, pues no va a tener su función bien. Los balines tienen que asegurarse que no se calienten de más. Tienen que estar rotando las almohadillas para que no se calienten más y se derritan los balines por dentro. Los balines se derriten como a los 450 grados.
All right, we're going to talk about the air pad rotation. Before I go on this there, I'm going to just tell you, I'll let you translate this right now. So if you have a program already in how you're rotating your pads, and it works, stick with it, all right? This is a baseline for somebody who's never had it or something, and where we're going to start. But if you already have a plan, and it's already working, by all means, stick with it. And I'm just going to tell you, that's over the course of the whole day. You can ask some questions, all that, I appreciate it. But if you have a plan and it's working for you, we don't expect you to change it, okay? This is going to be a baseline starting point for that, all right?
So, nosotros les vamos a dar nuestra recomendación de cómo hacer ciertas cosas, pero si ustedes tienen un sistema y ese sistema lo está trabajando para ustedes, sigan haciendo ese sistema, no tienen que usar nuestras recomendaciones como para las almohadillas y el servicio del motor de las máquinas.
All right. So we talked about rotating the air pads, and what we're talking about is just taking the pad and rotating it in the head, okay? So you need to turn this a minimum of once a day, right? Obviously, the more often you turn it, the better off it's going to be. The more even the wear is going to be. The problem is if you never rotate it, you're going to just be rubbing in one spot all day long, and it's just going to wear out. So we want to rotate it to make sure we get the longest life we can out of it. And then when we say exchange the pads, what we're talking about is take the old pads out, put the new pads in so you can have a chance and opportunity to inspect the other pads and make sure they're going, and then get good life out of all of them. What happens is if guys they'll run a set of pads, and then they run until they break, snap, and wear out, whatever. And then they have another fresh set in there, but then they have no backup at that point. So if you just make sure you're using the even life.
Algo que tienen que hacer es mínimo, una vez por día, rotar las almohadillas. O lo que quieren hacer es un cuarto de vuelta, como digo, mínimo una vez al día. Si tienen las almohadillas que son extras, entonces lo que pueden hacer es una vez por semana para que todas se estén gastando igual y tengan más vida de la almohadilla.
All right, the first thing I should have told you is I talked real fast, and I'm going to try to cover this as fast as possible. So if you have questions for Ricky, if I make sure you stop us right then, and that way we can address it and be on topic at the same time, all right? All right, air diffuser.
Dice que vamos a recorrer todo rápido, so si tiene alguna pregunta, párenos y hagan la pregunta.
All right, so we're going to talk about diffusers. Diffuser out there somewhere? Lost the prop. Well, man, my prop guy failed me. Anyway, we got a diffuser. We have a diffuser again. All right, we got a diffuser. All right, so the diffuser is responsible for helping the air circulate in the pad. So it goes in one end of the pad, you can see right here. The air goes in one end and then out the other. We need to make sure that we have air moving through there all the time. And if you have the water system applied with this as well, you'll want to make sure that that water has flowed through there as well. So the air is doing a couple of things. First of all, it's helping cool these beads, right? They cool the beads, we talked about it just a minute ago. Airflow goes through, we need to keep the beads cool, because at 450 degrees, these things will melt into a rock, right? The original purpose of these beads is they're a nylon injection molding resin, which is basically made, it goes into an extruder, they melt it into a part that's shaped and form. And that starts to happen at 450 degrees. The pads can get to 450 degrees in a hurry on a hot day. So you need to make sure we have them. How do we know we got air running through the pads? The air pad gauge, right? So your air gauge should be running anywhere from, say, 3 to 10 pounds. It's going to fluctuate depending on the system and stuff. But anyway, the things we want to look for is when the air pressure goes too high and stays high, that means more than likely your diffusers are plugged. As the pads start to work, the nylotron breaks down. It also starts to rub in the inside of the pad, and you get little pieces of rubber that will get stuck in here as well. So if the air pressure is high, you need to plug your diffuser. If the air pressure is low, when I say low, it drops to 0, that means that air system is open atmosphere more times than not. It's usually because the air hose that's feeding the pad has either come off or broken. So we need to make sure we keep an eye on the air gauge. We have pressure.
It gets rounded and becomes ball bearings. And we found that out of the wall. That's when we ran it. They actually stupid sounds and lock on
there's something else that's happening at the
If you get
same
them all
time.
rounded off, you got nothing but little ball
You're not
bearings.
getting enough
It
air
just
through there,
slips
but that
right on
heat
the damn hollow
is
pads.
also building up in the air pump. The air pump gets hot,
I just
it's going to
made that
lock
up.
up. It's going
No,
to
it's-
seize up, and then it won't spin, and then you'll have to break it free and break it loose again to get it moving. The other thing you need to remember is that the air pump needs to be flushed, and we'd like to see everybody do this annually. And so there's this thing that's all we'll talk about later. I actually did a great YouTube video on how to flush your air pump. So anyway, that needs to be done annually as well.
Uno de los mantenimientos de las almohadillas de aire son de los diffusers. Los diffusers se tienen que asegurar que siempre que estén desplugados, que no estén tapados. So, lo que pasa es de que en el gauge van a ver aquí si sube arriba de 15 libras es porque es más probable de que los diffusers estén plugados. Si miran que el gauge baja o baja a 0, lo más probable va a ser la manguera que va detrás de la almohadilla entrando a la almohadilla. Para prevenir que se calienten mucho las almohadillas, lo que están haciendo es les están metiendo aire para que ayude a sacar la calor y también unos sistemas llevan agua. Una de las otras cosas que Si se le tapan los diffusers, lo que puede pasar es que pueden dañar la pompa. La pompa se va a trancar y ya no va a querer girar. Dice que algo que recomendamos que hagan es de que limpien la pompa cada año. Para hacer eso hay un líquido que se le echa y ahí avienta todo el carbón, todo lo que lleva por dentro y lo saca.
Alright, next slide is really just to show what that airflow looks like and how that water system's injected. So the air pump we talked about, the air starts here, and then it works its way up through here, goes through this, and then out to the pad, into the back of the pad, and out of the front. So if you were to walk in front of the machine when it's running, you should feel that air. You know, quick check, you can feel that air blowing out the front of the pads to make sure that flow is going. If you have the water system, it's going to inject the water into the airstream. That's how that works, right? So take the water out of the tank, it goes in, and then it's inserted into the line, and then pushed out to the pad. So that's when you can see that little airflow of water out the front, not excessive. So kind of one of those things we kind of suggest is on when you're using the water system on small trees, sometimes you want to turn it off because sometimes it'll act like it's running.
Aquí tienen una foto de cómo corre el aire en el sistema. El aire sale de la bomba y entra al brazo y entra por la almohadilla y sale por un lado de la almohadilla y sale por el otro lado de la almohadilla. Hay unas máquinas que tienen el sistema de agua y lo único que es de que cada vez que le pican al botón para abrir la tijera, lo que va a pasar es inyecta poquita agua al sistema del aire y el aire se lo lleva por dentro de la almohadilla y ya lo saca por el otro lado. Algo que sugeríamos es de que si están sacudiendo árboles muy chiquitos y tienen el sistema del agua, que el sistema ese del agua lo apaguen para los árboles chiquitos.
Alright, next up we're going to talk about the oval pad, the hollow pad. Alright, we need to make sure we rotate these once a week, and when we say rotate, we mean flip it over, right? So, just a couple more things about the oval pads. They're less forgiving, they're shock absorbers. When you look at this, obviously it's not rocket science, so they wouldn't let you do this, right? But hey, this is a shock absorber. 4 inches of rubber on each side. You go through all the trouble. Take 174 horsepower, and you try to create this massive amount of shake, and try to transfer that to the tree, and then you want to push it through 4 inches of rubber on each side, right? Or you can push it through the one that has the thin 3/4 inch rubber side and transfers the maximum amount of energy to the tree. That's the main difference between the two. Here, yeah, cheap, easy to use, low maintenance. But we're not going to be able to transfer the power, and we're not going to have that adjustability for different size trees. We run this on the pistachio frames, all of them. It works right for that little bump and go we do on that. But if you have young almond trees especially, and you have to get into big trees, you're going to want that adjustability and the safety for the trees.
Algo de las almohadillas que son sólidas es de que esas tienen menos mantenimiento y eso también van a querer darle media vuelta, mínimo una vez a la semana. Lo único malo de esas almohadillas es de que no puedes transferir toda la energía de la sacudida a eso, porque lo que viene siendo es como un amortiguador grande. Y tampoco no es recomendable para los árboles que están muy chiquitos, porque los va a destruir, no se conforman al árbol. Lo que pasa es de que las aprietan en un solo lugar y se ponen los árboles.
Alright, next up we're going to talk about the slings. We'll talk about slings and even flow actually. Alright, so the slings have multiple purposes obviously. So here I have an example of a short sling. We call it a short sling, we call it a slip sling, we call it the cover sling, we call it the outer sling. There's a lot of different terms for the same sling, so which basically means this is the sling that comes in contact with the tree. The other one we have is the inner sling, the long sling, one that holds the pad in, right? So that's the purpose there. Why do we have to have 2 slings? Well, we need the 2 slings because we want this one to hold the pad in place, and we want this one to come in contact with the tree and stay on the tree firmly. How do we get those 2 to stop from barking the tree? do that by applying the lubricant in between, okay? So the lubricant goes in between, so these two pieces of rubber can slide. I'm sure you've all seen two pieces of rubber like this. You try to slide it, it won't slide. So we need to add the lubricant between them, and that's what the even flow is for. All right, on the even flow, on the 24-inch pads, there's 4 outlets. If you put a new one of these on, you need to make sure that we have lubricant coming out of those. I've seen plenty of these new ones, brand new ones, where we don't get flow out of all of them. The other thing you got to remember is when you're putting this on, is these 2 bolts in the center. The 2 in the center, if you over tighten those 2 bolts, you're going to cut the flow off. You can actually tighten it so tight here in the center that will cut the flow of water off to that. So we've actually split the sling clamp so you can tighten the 3 in the front and the 3 in the back, and leave the 2 in the center a little bit looser to make sure we get good clamping. Another thing you want to do, and John has a great YouTube video on this, by the way, is pre-treat the slings. You put new slings on, you want to make sure you pre-treat them. It's a little cheap insurance to make sure you're starting off on the trees right. So you'll take this, you'll let the sling, and then you're going to want to spear some silicone, or there's some other products out there you can use, but you just want to take some of the silicone and just put it all over the face of that to make sure when you first clamp on that new rubber, we have plenty of lubrication in between there and we're not marking the trees. The lubricant, along with a few other things, is really important for tree protection and not barking the tree. So when you put new ones on, make sure you got the flow and you're pre-treating. The other thing is you want to remember, one of the other things you want to remember, is the slings are directional, right? There's a thin side of rubber and there's a thick side of rubber. You can see that. Good rule of thumb is put the thick side out. That way we're going to get the maximum life out of the sling before we get to the cords, and that'll extend the life of that as well.
En las cabezas de las máquinas, de las armadillas, lleva 2 hules. Está un hule más largo y uno más corto. El hule más largo lo que hace es se envuelve alrededor de la armadilla para tener la armadilla en el brazo, en la cabeza, y luego sigue el even flow. El even flow lo que hace es lubricar todo el sistema. Cuando ponen un even flow nuevo, asegúrense de que le pongan la manguera y antes de ponerle el otro hule, píquenle al botón para que se aseguren que le salga el agua. Hay unos que, aunque sean nuevos, están tapados los hoyos. Y luego va el hule de afuera, y el hule de afuera también es direccional. So, si se fijan, tiene un lado más grueso que el otro. El lado más grueso lo van a querer en el lado de afuera, y eso es para que dure más el hule, porque si lo ponen al otro lado luego se van a exponer los hilos que llevan por dentro y ese hule ya no va a servir. Cuando pongan los hules nuevos, lo que pueden hacer es de los 3 tornillos de afuera de los dos, de esos los pueden apretar bien. Los 2 del medio, esos no van a querer apretarlos tanto, porque si lo apretan de más, lo que van a hacer es van a cortar la circulación del lubricante para las almohadillas. Otra cosa es que cuando pongan los hules nuevos, asegúrense de usar el silicón que le echan en el tanque de lubricación, echarle entre medio de los 2 hules, y eso les va a ayudar porque cuando ponen hules nuevos no van a estar picándole tanto al botón para que lubrique bastante. Eso es nomás algo para asegurarse que estén bien lubricados los hules.
Next up, we're going to talk about the paddle. Any questions on any of that?
¿Una pregunta?
All right, we'll talk about the auto lube and the water system pad. So, if your machine is equipped with the water pads, this is the auto lube. So this is the tank we're putting the silicone in with the water, and the other one is just pure water. This is the pure water that's going to go pumped out in through the pad, right? And this helps keep the pads cool. You know, I can't do this without giving props to Kenny in the back for coming up with this idea. So, I'd like to say this was all our idea, but actually, as most of our innovation ideas come from customers' feedback and ideas. So, we're open to all that, so if you do have ideas, things to make things better, feel free to offer that, right? So anyway, so the water comes out of here, and then we talked about injection to there. The important thing to remember is one's pure water and one's silicone. So on the notes in your handout, you'll see these notes on the bottom. This is based on the Frontier lubricant that we sell. I'm not pandering for Frontier. I'm just telling you these are the notes for that type of material. If you use some other type of material, obviously the mixture and ratio might be different. So anyway, it's 1 quart per 25 gallons. Means we're going to put 1 quart of silicone in there. I myself tend to be a little bit more liberal with the silicone just for a little cheap insurance. But so the silicone, 1 quart per 25 gallons, and pure water in the other one as well. Every time you hit the clamp open is when we inject the water out to the pads.
So aquí está el sistema de lubricación. No todas las máquinas tienen, pero hay máquinas que sí vienen con 2 tanques. Está el tanque de que va enfrente de la cabina y esa es pura agua. Esa agua es la que se inyecta dentro de las almohadillas. Y luego está el tanque que está detrás de la cabina y ese es el tanque que lubrica los fules que van en las almohadillas. Y ese tanque viene siendo de 25 galones y cuando lo llenan el tanque, asegúrense de ponerle mínimo 1/4 de silicón para que haga buena lubricación.
And one other thing, and Tyler's going to touch on this at the end of the day, right before you all go to sleep on him. He's going to touch on how we adjust the amount of flow. So that's actually adjusted electronically on the screen, but we're actually able to change the duration of the time in order to, add more or subtract water in the lubrication.
Otra cosa es de que esos sistemas de lubricación, los dos tienen ajustes, o pueden ajustar el tiempo o el tiempo que va a inyectar. Si quieren más agua, le van a subir el tiempo, ya sea en el tanque de frente o el de atrás.
Alright, so this is the last slide on pads and clamping and stuff. So that clamp pressure adjustment. So the clamp pressure adjustment happens in the cab, right behind basically the shoulder spread. Bottom it's basically the same general area. Catch-all, it's actually outside the cab. But some things, so this is just your basic procedure, which is documented in that handout. But the thing we want to remember here in this is we kind of got these parameters. We want to be between 800 and 900 on the low end and 1500 on the high end. We don't want to exceed the 1500. And when I say 800 to 900 on the low end, it's kind of a variable because what happens is as you're clamping, you're also holding oil back before it goes to the shake motor, right? So if that clamp arm actually takes over 800 pounds, 800 to 900 pounds to close, we're going to prematurely send oil down to the shake motor. It'll actually start shaking before it's fully clamped. So this can happen when the oil is cold. So if you're doing winter shake or something, you have that clamp pressure, it's super low for those. It's just going to be a slower process. You just need to realize that. So you might have to jack that pressure up a little bit. So kind of the rule of thumb had always been 100 psi per inch of diameter of tree, right? So if you have a 10-inch tree, theoretically that's 1,000 psi, but really you have to go closer to that 1,200 psi range. But just remember, don't go below 800 or 900 and never, ever exceed that 1,500. The other thing you're going to run into is with the 1,500 is you have to have a pressure differential between the clamp pressure and the sequence pressure. It's kind of a time gap so that the head has time to shut before the oil goes out to the shake motor. And if the clamp arm struggles to close at 800 or 900, you're going to get that pressure build up. You're also going to have it set your clamp pressure above 1,500. The time it gets to that pressure, you're already going to shake it.
Uno de los ajustes que tienen las máquinas son el ajuste de la presión que va a tener la cabeza para sacudir. Esas presiones no quieren que sea menos de 800 o más de 1500. Dependiendo del tamaño del árbol va a ser la presión que quieres. Un árbol más pequeño va a ser la presión de 800 a 900. Si le bajan mucho la presión, lo que va a pasar es de que va a empezar a sacudir la cabeza antes de completamente cerrar. Y también si sube mucho la presión, lo que puede pasar es de que el aceite va a llegar para otro lado. So, no le va a dar tiempo igual de cerrar y va a empezar a sacudir. Y el ajuste este está dentro de la cabina, detrás del hombro derecho de uno.
Just laughing at the bumblebee terrorizing Tyler there. So. All right, next up we're going to talk about shake head, preventative maintenance, and some of the things we need to be aware of. So, but before we get started, I think the first thing we need to do is talk about how to identify which shaker head you have, all right? So over the years, we've come up with a lot of different shaker heads. So, and this is our current new generation. And they're all the R series heads. What's R stand for? That means they're all robotically welded, okay? So let's start at the top. This is the R3. So the R3 is the standard head for your monoboom, all right? Go next to it right here is the R5. And this is the standard head for the catching frame. It's hard to just look in this flag and see the difference, but it's considerably shorter. And we made it shorter so that we could get it under the catching frame. But we moved the weight stack off to the side so that we could get the same impact and power from the larger center swing into the catching frame, right? Down at the bottom here, this is our R4. 30 some odd years, I think, of making these large heads for pecans. We've never sold one in California, so you probably never see it. But we do offer a head that opens up to 30 inches for very, very large pecan trees. And then down here in the corner is the R7. So the R7 is the latest head we use for side mounts. So generally every new side mount you see come out will have an R7 on it, all right? So the R7, some of the distinguishing difference between this is obviously the overall length, but the way the belt is adjusted as well. So on the R7, the belt is adjusted via the shake motor, and on the R3, it's adjusted right here on top. All right, so here you go. Here's an exception to a rule. Here's a side mount with an R3 on it. So this is actually a lifted sprint because it's going to end up doing some hedgerow walls as well.
Aquí está una identificación de las cabezas. So, estas son 4 cabezas, no son todas, pero son las que están en producción ahorita. Y una de las maneras de distinguirlas, pues la R3, está la R3 que viene en la monoboom, mayormente en la monoboom. Está la R5 que viene, esas sí nomás vienen en las máquinas para el pistacho. Está la R4 no se va a ver aquí en California, esa la usan más en las nueces en otros estados. Y esa lo que tiene es que abre más ancho, abre hasta 30 pulgadas para poder sacudir los árboles más grandes. Y luego está la R7. La R7 viene en la mayoría de las sprints. En esta no, porque esta también la vamos a usar para las nueces. Esa tiene la cabeza R3. La manera de distinguir una R3 a una R7 viene siendo el ajuste. En la R3 el ajuste está acá arriba en una de las poleas, y en la R7 se ajusta en el motor para sacudir.
All right, next up, this is actually just a copy of the decal that's in the window, on the driver's side window on that door. You should see this decal on your machine. And basically this is a friendly reminder of the things you need to look for on your machine, all right? So basically what we're telling you is the machine shakes, things are going to come loose. We need to make sure we check those on a regular basis, nuts, bolts, fitting, shaker head, tilt section, things like that, right? But the next couple paragraphs are what we're going to describe in the next few slides. And the importance of adjusting the energy wheel, pin bolt, and the shaker head belt tension, right? These are the next 5 slides are going to be super critical as to what we need to make sure we're looking for.
Esta calcomanía está en todas las máquinas y te va a decir los torques de la cabeza del tornillo que va en la estrella de la cabeza, te va a decir que lo chequees a diario, cosas que pueden tener, precauciones que tienen que tener con la máquina, pero tiene muchas cosas importantes que tienen que leer.
All right, energy wheel pin. My old famous hand model, Kevin. show everybody where the individual pin is. So on the shaker head, this is the main pin that goes through the center of the wheels of the weights. So as you all know, what makes this work are a couple of counter-rotating masses, but we need to make sure that we keep this pin tight. This bolt needs to be tight. When I say tight, 700 foot-pounds, most everybody doesn't have a torque wrench that's going to go to 700 foot-pounds. You don't have a torque wrench, you can get a torque multiplier with the torque wrench to get there. If you don't have a torque multiplier, 1.5-inch socket, and a 5 or 6 foot bar and everything you got on it, all right? So you want to make sure it is tight, and we want to make sure we check it on a daily basis, all right? So one of the things we run into here is, especially when we go out and work on a piece of equipment, we'll go out, we'll change your bearings for you, and we'll do all that. We're going to shake it a few times, and then we're going to tighten it again before we leave, right? But after that, there's still this other step that needs to be done, which is run it for about 4 hours and then check it again, and then check it, every 4 hours for the first day of running, because what you're going to want to do is make sure that thing stays tight, right? And then check it every day. I know that the slide, I'm sorry, says check it every day for the first week and the week after. It's cheap insurance. Just check it daily. If you've seen all the harvesters out here running around and about, I think there's 28 of them now that we do. Every one of those gets checked every day. You want to make sure you're checking that bolt every day. 700 foot-pounds, that bar, everything you got on it, every day. The one thing I want to emphasize, especially, is if you have somebody come out and do the work, you're still going to need, and you're going to be responsible for making sure you check it in afterwards, okay? So, you don't want to just check it once, you want to make sure you check it every day.
So algo que en esta foto es el tornillo de la estrella que detiene todas las piezas. Ese tornillo van a querer asegurarse que siempre esté apretado, y el torque del tornillo son de 700 libras. Si no tienen una llave como para torquear, lo que pueden hacer es agarrar un dado con una pipa soldada y de unos 5 a 6 pies de largo de la pipa, y darle todo lo que da. Si alguien va a cambiar las pesas o el tornillo o el perno que va por dentro, lo que van a querer hacer es de sacudir unos 2 o 3 veces y chequear otra vez que esté bien apretada. Primero, cuando le cambien los tornillos, lo que van a querer hacer es cada 4 horas estar chequeando el torque, que esté bien apretada por el primer día, y de ahí en fuera estarlo chequeando cada día, porque si se llega a aflojar el tornillo ese, lo que va a pasar es va a joder la estrella y todo lo de dentro.
All right, we're going to talk about the head now. Some actual similarities in what we just talked about, right? So it's a maintenance item. We need to make sure we check it on a regular basis. The other thing we want to do is same thing, right? We put a new one in. First of all, you put a new belt in, you're going to want to ask yourself, why did I lose the belt, right? Maybe it's just old, maybe it's wore out. That might be the case, but if it broke or something, you want to make sure you're checking it after you install the belt. You want to shake it a few times, make sure the belt's good and tight. You want to start looking for things like nicks on the belts, lines on the back side of the belt. Make sure everything is aligned properly, so you're not, you don't put a new belt in and then lose it right away because you didn't notice something, maybe the bearings wobbling or something in the idler. The drive shift is misaligned. Anyway, you want to make sure you're checking for those, and then check the belt tension. Shake it a few times, and then check the belt tension again. All right? Then every after the first hour, and then every 4 hours after the first day, same scenario, right? You have somebody come out, and one of the mechanics from here or Tulare, they come out and they change the belt, right? They're going to go out, they're going to change the belt, they're going to shake it a few times, tighten it up again. They're going to be on their way, and then you're still going to need to go back and make sure that belt's tight later, okay? So it's super important that you're checking the belt tension of it, and you'll want to check this every day before you get started. And as Kevin talks about bearings here in a little bit, kind of you'll know that you can have that door off and look at that grease pattern as well. All right. Talk about the direction of the belt. There's no quicker way to actually split the belt off, in my opinion, and then to run the wheels backwards, right? So whenever you take the door off the head, in every one of the shaker heads, you're going to see that belt. It's going to be going this direction. This is on the bottom. The belt's going to be going from the back to the front, every time. So you make sure that happens. So what we see a lot is guys who take the head off, will do some repair on it or something like that, they go put it back on. You get the hoses backward, and next thing you know, this is spinning backwards. You got to spin the belt off on her. Sometimes you can run through trees before you spin it off, but eventually it's going to do that. The other way we can make this happen is by setting the head brake too tight, okay? If you set the head brake so tight that after you shake it, then the head brake comes on to stop the head, you can make it stop so fast that at the end of the thing, it goes through and it's shaking, stops, and then as it stops, then the oil will actually back up inside of there, and it'll turn the wheels backward. And if it goes and you do a whole revolution, you can lightly spit the belt off the backside of that wheel.
Algo más que tienen que asegurarse es la tensión de la banda que va dentro de la cabeza. La tensión esa quiere que siempre esa banda siempre esté apretada y que esté corriendo para el lado donde debe de ser. Si alguien de nosotros o ustedes cambian una banda por cualquier razón, tienen que asegurarse que esa banda siempre esté corriendo para donde debe. So, la manera de chequear es en la polea de atrás donde está el motor, esa tiene que siempre ir para adentro para las pesas. Si camina la banda para otro lado, lo que la va a escupir, la va a aventar para afuera. La razón que eso pasa, hemos visto que pasa mucho, es de que van a cambiar una manguera o lo que sea y las ponen al revés. Y lo que pasa es de que todo el mundo va a sacudir la cabeza y todo, pero la banda la va a escupir. Otra de las cosas que vemos es de que si le suben a la breca mucho, de la cabeza, no de la máquina. So, en la cabeza lleva una breca para que pare de sacudir. Si esa breca se la ajustan de más, lo que puede pasar es que se pare en seco y el aceite de todo va a correr y le va a dar vuelta para otro lado al motor y va a escupir la banda. La banda, pues si la reemplazan, la tienen que chequear una hora después de que la reemplacen y del primer día cada 4 horas. Igual, cuando la van a chequear la grasa a los boleros o lo que sea, chequense, asegúrense que esté apretada la banda.
Alright, next up, short and sweet, right here. The shaker head motor. Alright, there are 4 bolts that hold the motor on. This is the R7, and this is the R3. By the way, the majority of the pictures that are in your handout are actually out of the owner's manual, so you can find some of this information. This is basically a depiction out of that. Alright, there are 4 bolts holding the shaker motor on. They're 14 millimeter bolts. What happens is if these bolts get loose, the head motor has this opportunity to rotate. We try to capture it the best we can. But if it rotates, what happens is it breaks the corners of the casting off. And once it's broke those corners of the casting off, hydraulically the motor is still good, but you can't hold it in place. So you basically rendered this expensive motor useless, right? So what we do, we want to make sure we're checking these bolts on a regular basis, okay? If you do have to replace the bolts with a 14 millimeter. That way it will occupy and use up all the space in here. It'll be a nice snug fit as well. And make sure you use stover bolts as well, stover nuts as well.
Algo más que tienen que inspeccionar a diario, los tornillos del motor para sacudir la máquina, la cabeza. So, esos tornillos tienen que asegurarse que están apretados, porque si no se aprietan, lo que va a hacer es que el motor adentro de la cabeza va a bailar. Y cuando empieza a bailar, que se tiene movimiento, lo que va a pasar es que las orejas donde se detienen los tornillos se van a quebrar. Al quebrarse los agujeros, ese motor ya no sirve, ya no lo pueden usar porque no va a tener manera de sujetarse. Algo más es de que si llegan a reemplazar los tornillos, asegúrense que sean los tornillos que sean de tamaño 14 milímetros, porque si no, va a quedar bailando el motor. Entre más apretado esté todo, es mejor.
All right, hinge pin. So this is the rear of the clamp arm. Kevin's going to show you where this is. On the very back right there, right? So I'm going to skip right to this bottom line. Grease it daily. When I say daily, that means every shift. You run 2 shifts, and grease it twice a day. Can't grease it too much. There's no seals in there to blow out. You cannot, all you can do is make a mess, but more grease is better, all right? So inside this, there are 2 bronze bushings, one top and bottom pressed into the arm. That's why we're lubricating to keep that lubricated and swinging easy. We have 2 nylotron discs, top and bottom. Those discs stop all that metal stack from wearing into the arm prematurely if we grease it properly. And then we have the pin that goes through this bushing, which is what we pull down to keep that snug, all right? And then we have a calso nut on top. The question is, how tight do you get the calso nut, right? What's the purpose of the calso nut? The only purpose of that calso nut is to stop the arm from moving up and down. So how do we check to see if that tension is correct on that, Kevin? What a pry bar, and wiggle the arm up and down. If you can move that arm up and down, you know you need to tension that. What happens is a lot of guys get a little overzealous on this and they want to tighten it and tighten it. You get it too tight, first of all, you're just going to wear these things out in a hurry. Then you're going to be metal to metal to metal, and we're going to be grinding into the clamp arm. This is simply to stop the arm from moving up and down. It's not tension to hold it all nice and tight together. It's just enough to stop the arm from floating up and down. And once again, grease it, grease it, grease it.
En el brazo de la cabeza empezó con que grasa, échenle bastante grasa a la grasera que va en el donde está el perno. Los componentes del brazo aquí son 2 bujes de bronce, son 2 discos de plástico y lleva el perno y la tuerca. So, algo que van a querer hacer es chequear que esté bien apretada la tuerca. No la quieren muy apretada porque si no, lo que va a pasar es van a desgastar los discos. La manera de chequear es que se le mete una barra por debajo entre la cabeza y el brazo, y si tiene movimiento por arriba y por abajo van a querer apretar la tuerca. Ya cuando le van a apretar hasta que ya no tenga movimiento y ponerle el perno que va adentro donde está la tuerca.
All right, next up, suspension mount. Just so happens Kevin's in the exact right spot right now. So, all right, we don't want to over tension the rubber mounts, the suspension mounts. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we tighten them enough, just tight enough so that this mount here and this mount here, you can just barely move by hand. Oh, it's on a stand, but basically when it's hanging there, you should barely be able to squeak this around, right? You should be able to squeak this one around. You shouldn't be able to move this one because it has all the weight of the head along with this one here as well. But these 2 here, you should just be able to barely squeak those around. What happens is when you get it too tight, all you're going to do is prematurely wear those mounts out. The other thing to keep in mind here that helps with premature failure of the mounts is driving with the shaker head up. Everybody wants to go down the road with the head up like this, and it puts all the weight on those bolts and mounts like this as you're bouncing along the road. Ideally, if you can drive with the head down, I know there's a lot of times when you don't have the space for that, but if you're driving with the head flat, you're putting a lot less wear and tear on this. What happens over the long term is you start elongating the holes on this, elongating the holes on that as well. The other thing that has a dramatic effect on the life of these, and we have this last couple days, is where you line up with the tree and how far you have to pull the head over. If you go out to the tree, and the tree's all the way over here, and then you're pulling the head sideways all the time. So ideally, obviously you want to get the tree as close as you can to the stationary set. But if you're pulling that tree over or pulling the head over a couple inches, that's also going to be extremely hard on the mounts as well.
Otra de las cosas de la suspensión de la cabeza van a ser los zules que llevan deteniendo toda la cabeza. Estos zules, cuando la cabeza esté en el aire, en esa no, porque está sostenida con la parte de abajo, pero van a querer darle que no queden muy apretadas. La manera de chequear es de que esos zules que están moviendo, que esos tengan poquito movimiento, que no tengan mucho. El de mero arriba y el de mero abajo tener movimiento, pero los dos del medio sí. Otra cosa es de que cuando van a mover la máquina, cuando mueven la máquina de un filo a otro, Lo ideal fuera de tener la cabeza así como está. Cuando pone la cabeza uno para arriba y que va por la carretera, lo que pasa es de que le pone mucha presión donde van los agujeros, donde van los tornillos, y se pueden gastar más pronto, más rápido los hules y los agujeros donde van los tornillos.
All right, next step we'll talk about the grease points on the head. We actually already talked about the rear hinge pin one, and then there are two other ones on this. They need to be greased daily as well. Once again, daily means once per shift. So if you run 2 shifts, you gotta make sure you grease it twice.
Otra cosa es uno de los lugares, no todos, pero uno de los lugares que ocupan bastante grasa va a ser en la cabeza, y luego va a ser en los 2 pernos que van en el cilindro por dentro, que abre y cierra la tijera.
All right, next slide. We're going to talk about greasable head bearings. All right, I'll leave this to Kevin. He's been doing an excellent job explaining this.
All right, greasable bearings. This year, if you bought a new machine, your machine is equipped with externally greasable bearings, which is greased from the outside. You also have grease zerks inside, which are more as a safety backup if you break one of the grease zerks, or if you can't get grease into one of those zerks.
Si compraron una máquina este año, la máquina va a venir con un tubo de grasa y una grasera. La máquina en las estrellas lleva una grasera arriba y una grasera abajo. Lleva graseras por adentro de la cabeza donde están las pesas, pero esas son por si no le entra grasa a las graseras de fuera, por ahí lo pueden engrasar.
Also, this year, with your machine, you got a grease gun and also a tube of IMG Frontier grease. It's very important. This is the grease we recommend. It's very important that you do not mix grease. What can happen is if the bases are not the same, it'll either solidify or it could just become liquefied and come out the bearings and you lose the lubrication inside the bearings.
Como digo, si compraron una máquina nueva este año, va a venir con un tubo de grasa, de la grasa que usamos nosotros en la pata, y también una grasera. Es muy importante que no mezclen las grasas. Si es mejor usar esa grasa y usar esa grasa nomás para los valeros.
Alright, so when greasing your machine, you want to make sure that this is what your head door looks like every day. So he's actually pointing to the head door. What you'll do is, let's say you start shaking. Before you start shaking, you're going to grease your bearings. Let's say you start with 25 pumps. You're going to run all day. The next morning when you start, you're going to pull that head door off. When you pull that head door off, it should look like this, a light speckling of grease. If you have too much grease on here, a bunch of globs, you're going to want to back off 5 pumps. If you have a bunch of dust, you're going to want to add 5 pumps.
El modo de chequear la grasa en los valeros va a ser de que en la puerta esa la quitar, y van a chequear que tenga grasa en la puerta. Si no tiene grasa, que sea puro polvo, ocupa más grasa. También tampoco no quieren mucha grasa, porque si no van a dañar cosas por dentro. Pero lo ideal es de empezar con 25 compassos al día en cada estrella, una arriba y una abajo, y ponerla todo ese día. A otro día van a quitarle la puerta otra vez y chequear cuánta grasa tiene. Como digo, si tiene puro polvo, ocupa más grasa, son 5 compassos. Si tiene grasa de más, entonces van a disminuirle, le bajan otros 5, o le bajan 5 compassos.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, so here's my little spiel on this part, right? So your new machine comes with this. If you get a new machine this year, it comes with a grease gun. It comes without tube of grease. All right. It's important that we're greasing. We get really a long life out of the bearings of the head now. But everybody's on the warranty side. Everybody wants to more times than not, when we go out to a machine and the bearings are out in the greasables, we usually find one or two things. One, it's either bone dry, no grease at all, or two, it's just chock full of brand new grease. There's not a whole lot of in between. So make sure that you're greased. Whatever you start with, end with. That way you make sure that you're not mixing the greases and that you have some premature problems with the bearing. All right, any questions?
So, dice de que es muy importante de que si con la grasa que empiecen, no la abstienen, sigan echando esa grasa. Algo que vemos nosotros dice que cuando se le ponen los valeros, es de que se ven dos cosas, o no tiene nada de grasa o tiene pura grasa nueva. No se le olviden de engrasar los valeros. Como dice, lleva una grasera por fuera en cada lado y si están tapadas que no entra grasa, usen las graseras de dentro.
All right, questions?
¿Preguntas?
All right, let's take a...
Is the most current emissions compliance. It's not required in the United States yet. It is in Europe, but it is moving in that direction. So OMC is getting ahead of the game there.
So, el Cummins, como dice, tiene etapa 5 en emisiones. So, no es requerido todavía en los Estados Unidos, es nomás en Europa, pero nosotros vamos para allá también.
So we're going to start out with the 3.8 liter Cummins. That goes in our catch-all tin systems, our bin carrier, our AR400, and our AR450.
En el motor 3.8, que viene siendo el motor más chico de Cummins, está en la recibidora del pistacho, está en el AR7, en AR400 y el AR450.
And then we have our 4.5, which goes in our Hedgehog, and then our new AR500 as well.
Y está el motor que es un poco más grande, que viene siendo el 4.5, que tiene la máquina que está aquí afuera, la Hedgehog, y también el nuevo el AR500.
So if you come across an issue or need some service, the first thing to note is the ID tag on your engine, so we can jump ahead of the game and figuring out what the issue is. So on the 3.8, that ID tag is on the turbo side of the valve cover, located in those images there.
Algo de importancia es saber qué motor tiene, y para saber eso está la etiqueta del número de serie encima de la cabeza a un lado del turbo en el motor 3.8.
And on the 4.5, it's on top of the valve cover, closer to the fan side.
En el motor 4.5, la etiqueta esa va a estar encima de la cabeza, más cerca del abanico.
So we're going to get into the service intervals for these engines. So on the 3.8, there's both a primary and secondary fuel filter. Those both get serviced at 1,000 hours. The primary is located off the engine. It is mounted to the chassis itself. And the secondary filter is actually mounted to the engine, located right here.
So, en los motores, en el 3.8 va a tener dos filtros de diésel. El primer filtro de diésel va a estar montado en algún lugar en la máquina. El segundo filtro va a estar montado, es el más largo de aquí. Y esos se van serviciados cada 1000 horas.
Additionally, we want to make sure with the oil and oil filter, the oil filter is located right here next to the secondary. It is changed at 250 hours, requires a 5W40 API rating CJ4.
Otro filtro va a ser el filtro del aceite, que está localizado aquí, y ese filtro se va a cambiar cada 250 horas, y ese lleva aceite 540.
And then the part numbers for these filters are listed here as well. Those are the Cummins numbers.
Los números, los filtros van a ser esos, y esos son los números de Cummins.
Similarly, on the 4.5, again, our fuel filters are serviced at 1,000 hours. The primary is located off the engine on the chassis. The secondary is located on the engine, right here.
Al igual que el otro motor, el 4.5 lleva dos filtros de diésel. El primer filtro va a estar montado en un lugar en la máquina, dependiendo de la máquina, y el segundo filtro va a estar en el motor. Esos filtros también van cambiados cada 1000 horas.
And then the oil filter and oil are changed on 500 hours, and the filter is located on the turbo side here. And then those part numbers again are listed here.
El otro filtro va a ser el del aceite. El filtro del aceite está localizado a un lado del motor, abajo del turbo, y esos son cada 500 horas. Y esos son los números de parte del Cummins.
Questions or preguntas?
¿Preguntas?
Okay, one that's often forgotten up is the DEF system. So this is newer on a lot of our machines. So the primary thing to note is the filter on the DEF pump itself. There's a removable cap and then an element that gets placed in there, and that should be serviced at every 2,000 hour interval, and here's the part number for that.
Algo más, otro filtro va a ser en el sistema del DEF. En el sistema del DEF, en la bomba, abajo tiene una tapadera y se le quita la tapadera y está un filtro. Este filtro se recomienda cambiarse cada 2000 horas.
Additionally, we can introduce debris and foreign objects into the tank while we're filling. So as needed, you can replace a strainer on both the filler neck and the suction line. So those are located here and here. And then those part numbers are given here as well.
Otra cosa que suele pasar es que entra basura al sistema del DEF y para poder prevenir basura más grande va a ser un sedazo que está aquí y luego aquí tiene un filtro que también puede cambiarse. Y eso se van a cambiar dependiendo la basura que tenga dentro del tanque del DEF.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the CAT engines. These are a Tier 4 final engine.
Vamos a hablar del motor CAT.
So we have the 3.4, which is on our elevators, and then we have the 4.4, which goes in our Sprint and monoboom.
Tenemos dos motores, el 3.4 que viene nomás en los elevadores y está el 4.4 que viene en las Sprints y en las monobooms.
So again, the ID tag on the 3.4 is located on the cooling package as shown here, and that serial number will start with the CJ3.
El modo de identificar el motor va a ser una etiqueta que tiene el 3.4 al lado del radiador y va a empezar con la letra CJ3.
And on the 4.4, the ID tag is on the overflow tank, and that number will start with the JKT.
En el motor 4.4 la etiqueta esa va a estar en el tanque de reservoir y vas a empezar con las letras JKT.
So with our 3.4, the service intervals, our primary and secondary fuel filter are 500 hours. They're both located on the engine itself. The secondary is up here, the primary is down here. That primary is also that fuel water separator and priming pump. The oil filter will be serviced at 250 hours, and the CAT requires a 1540.
En el motor 3.4 también tiene dos filtros de diésel, tiene este de acá de abajo que viene siendo el primero, ese también le pueden sacar el agua si entra el agua al diésel y el segundo está más arriba. Esos cambian cada 500 horas. El filtro de aceite que viene siendo este gris que está aquí, ese se cambia cada 250 horas y lleva aceite 1540.
And then the Caterpillar numbers are listed here as well.
Y los primeros números que están ahí son números de Caterpillar.
And then with our 4.4, our primary and secondary fuel filters are again at 500 hours. They're both located on the engine, right here and here. And then we have our engine oil, which is at 250 hours, 1540. And then we're actually adding another one on this engine, our crankcase ventilation element. So as the engine's running, it produces a positive pressure in the crankcase. That's vented to atmosphere, and so we filter that ventilation in this canister here. So you screw the top off, put a new element in there, and that's serviced at every 500 hours.
Al igual que los otros motores, este 4.4 lleva dos filtros de diésel, igual tienen que ser cambiados a cada 500 horas, lleva el filtro del aceite que está mero abajo, ese va cambiado cada 250 horas y lleva aceite 1540. Este lleva otro filtro y viene siendo el filtro del resolladero del motor. Y ese se recomienda que se cambie cada 500 horas.
And then with the CAT DEF system, again, there's an element in the pump itself. So this is located by the DEF tank on a Sprint, and then the element is dropped in right there.
En el sistema del DEF, la bomba lleva un filtro también que se recomienda cambiar cada 500 horas.
And that's serviced at 500-hour intervals. So with the DEF, the key point to talk about is ensure we actually get it in the right tank. So I have here, this is DEF and diesel. So the first thing to note is if you happen to pour this into your diesel tank, make sure you drain it. So don't start the engine, don't key it on. Make sure you drain that out. If you don't, you're gonna fire that thing up and it's gonna mix it all together. And now you're gonna have DEF and diesel throughout your fuel system. And what's gonna happen is you have finely machined, high tolerance steel components. Those are gonna rust and you're gonna wipe out your whole fuel system.
So algo de gran importancia va a ser que se aseguren de echarle el DEF donde va y el diesel donde va también. Si llegan a mistear que le echen DEF al diesel, lo que van a querer es no prender el motor, tirarle todo el diésel y lavar el tanque y echarle diésel nuevo, porque si pueden dañar todos los inyectores por dentro y líneas.
And then even worse is if you decide to put DEF into your hydraulic system. So we dye our hydraulic oil red as well. And again, if you happen to pour that into your tank, first thing to do, don't key it on, drain it. If you don't, again, you're going to mix it all up. You're going to send that through your whole hydraulic system. You've got exposed steel parts, high tolerance, and rust. If you look at our machines, they're made up of an engine and a ton of hydraulic components. You're going to take all that out. You might as well throw out the machine and start over.
So algo poquito
Put that
peor
shit
para
to
hacer
your
es echarle
hydraulic
DEF al sistema hidráulico.
Machine's
Lo que va a
done.
pasar es de que hay muchas cosas que se van a enmojecer porque el DEF es hecho mayormente de agua y se van a enmojecer y lo que va a pasar es que esa máquina ya no va a servir.
And a final thing to note is, and we're going to cover this in detail, but making sure you keep your air filters clean. Want to keep foreign debris out of your engine. It takes a gram of dust per horsepower to wipe an engine out. So on our Sprints, if you took just under half of this in dust and had that go through the intake, you would wipe that engine out. So it's important to keep those clean and serviced, and we'll detail that here shortly.
Una cosa de importancia es de asegurarse que el sistema del aire siempre esté limpio. So, ocupa 1 gramo de tierra por caballo de fuerza del motor para poder el motor. ¿Preguntas?
Any questions on any of that? All right, we'll get back to the other. I'm gonna, as I load this other PowerPoint, tell a story. Alan was talking about DEF in your hydraulic system. It takes a fair effort because they're nowhere near each other to do it. But I can tell you, had a customer do exactly that. But ended up with some DEF in the hydraulic system, and he's currently still fighting with his insurance company to get the machine covered. Has replaced almost every part on the machine hydraulically, replaced the entire hose kit, every hose on it, and is still trying to figure this out. It is a super quick way. You start circulating that DEF through there, you're going to have nothing.
Es muy importante de asegurarse de no echar líquidos que no van en ciertos tanques, en esos tanques, porque si lo que va a pasar es que van a dañar todo el sistema. Hay una persona que sí le echaron DEF adentro del sistema hidráulico y han reemplazado los motores, pompas, mangueras y hasta ahorita de todo modo las máquinas no sigue igual, no sigue bien.
All right, I'm going to start this next section off. Some basic PM stuff. and things to look for. We talked about fluids and things. All right, first up, we're going to go through the warnings. And so these warning decals are located on the machines. Actually, all the machines have these decals in some place or form. All right, first off, it's the stay back 50 feet, it's kind of the standard for farm equipment. And then over here we have our Prop 65 information, along with a little bit of information like don't drive your machine on the highway. It needs to be trailer stop for highway services. That. The critical one we'll talk about right now is do not pressure wash. Okay, on the Sprint, there's this black box. Behind that little black wall are some electronic components that are not 67 or 68 rated. So anyway. They're not rated for pressure washing. So you can wash it, but you don't want to stick that nozzle back in there or you're going to have some problems with those electronics.
So, en todas las máquinas hay calcomanías y la primera es de que si están operando una máquina y hay alrededor, asegúrense que esa persona esté más de 50 pies de la máquina. La segunda va a ser de precauciones de cómo mover la máquina y cosas de esas. Otra cosa es una calcomanía que lleven una caja detrás aquí dentro de esta caja, que asegúrense de no lavarla con alta presión. Lo que pasa es de que si la lavan con alta presión, pueden dañar los cables o cables que van por dentro de la caja negra.
All right, fluids. Alan talked about some of this as well as we talked about earlier. So on the side of the Sprint where it's shown as an example, we have the lubrication system. Lubrication system is where you put the silicone in the water in the large plastic tank in the center. Then below that, you have the diesel, which requires ultra-low sulfur diesel, as it's indicated. And then we have the DEF. They're distinguishing different spots. I have no idea how you go from DEF to the hydraulic tank, which is underneath the other side, but it has been done. But anyway, so you got the diesel and the DEF next to it. All the servicing is right there on that side, along with your air filter and your filter minder, which we will beat up on later.
Detrás de la cabina está una parte donde está el tanque de lubricación de la cabeza. Está el lugar donde le echan diésel y DEF. So asegúrense de siempre echarle diesel donde va el diesel y DEF donde va el DEF. Y también está el filtro del aire. So asegúrense de que todo vaya bien.
All right, next up, we're going to talk about the hydraulic fluid. So we use AW46 hydraulic fluid, and that's the fluid that's recommended by the manufacturers of the components we use, so the hydrostat, wheel motors, PVG valve, things of that nature. This is what they recommended for our application. I get a lot, can I switch to 68? The answer is no. So anyway, they stick with the AW46. This is what's recommended for this application and this use at the temperatures we run. All right. Along with that, on the oil level indicators on the side of the tank where you can see it if you look at the opposite side. All right. The service interval for the oil, there is a service interval, right? And it's about 2 years or 2,000 hours, right? I know a lot of people, they don't change the oil. They're never going to change the oil, in the hydraulic oil, I should say. If you're not changing the oil, you should at least filter it. You should run a filter buggy in it and make sure you're cleaning the oil on a regular basis.
Sí, en el sistema hidráulico, asegúrense de usar el aceite AW46. De un lado del tanque del aceite está el nivel. Ahí les va a indicar a dónde está el nivel del aceite. Asegúrense de filtrar, por lo menos filtrar el aceite cada 2 años. Si no lo filtran, cámbienlo. Es importante que lo estén filtrando porque por más precavido que sea uno, de todos modos le entra tierra y hay que filtrar el aceite.
All right, next up, we're going to talk about the hub and brake fluids. So on the machines, it doesn't matter if it's a shuttle, a shaker, a Sprint. We need to make sure we change the oil in the hubs, all right? And that includes the non-powered hubs. So in this particular case, like on the shuttle, you got the powered one in the front, non-powered in the front, powered back, we need to change the oil, and we do this annually. It's super important that we use synthetic oil. We use synthetic 7590, and you have to use that because the synthetic dissipates the heat better, and we run these hubs at a very, very high speed. Do this annually. So basically what do? We put the drain plug down to 6 to drain it, rotate it up to 3 or 9, and then fill it. So you're filling it halfway. Next on the slide, we'll talk about the hydraulic fluid and the brake, all right? So the brake doesn't get serviced, so you don't have to go and change the oil in the brake, but if you replace the brake, rebuild the brake, you have to put new springs in it, new disc in it, you're going to take it apart, you need to make sure you put oil back in it. That oil that goes in it is the same as the hydraulic system. It's AW46.
En el sistema de las ruedas, algo que es muy importante que cambien el aceite en los hubs de mero afuera, y no importa si tienen engranes por dentro o no, asegúrense de cambiar el aceite que usa ahí es sintético 7590, y asegúrense de usar el aceite sintético porque el sintético lo que hace es de que se mantiene más frío el sintético que el que no es sintético. Y como digo, es de cambiar el aceite mínimo una vez al año. Algo más va a ser el aceite en las brecas. El aceite en las brecas, cada vez que cambien una breca, asegúrense de echarle aceite, y el aceite es AW46. O si van a serviciar la breca, que le van a cambiar resortes o discos o lo que sea por dentro, asegúrense de echarle aceite AW46.
All right, next up is the intake hydraulic filters, right? So there's 2 suction filters for the pumps. So those filter the oil before they go into the pumps. They don't really filter, just basically keeping the large contaminants out of the pump that may or have ended up in tank. The one that's important right here is this intake hydraulic return filter, right? So this needs to be changed annually. We need to make sure we're doing that. That's the one that's going to catch all the debris and all the contaminants that come into the system. If you have some type of large failure, catastrophic failure, some sort of wheel motor, hydrostat, things like that, you'll want to make sure you're cleaning the tank, make sure that you're changing the filter. And if you have the tank empty, it's also a good time to check those 2 suction strainers. Can't say enough about changing the filter and the cleanliness of the tank. As things progress on the machines, we have pumps and the valves have tighter tolerances. The guys have talked about everything is just smaller orifices. You look inside the PVJ valve. There's tiny little orifices that the oil has to go through. There's little screens inside these coils where the oil has to go through. And you get debris in there, it starts plugging things up, and we start having issues. So it's super important that we keep and then we'll change the filters on a regular basis. So all the screens you'll actually see from now on, we have the 60 number, these 60 series part numbers and Orchard Machinery part numbers for those parts.
Algo de importancia va a ser los filtros que llevan en el sistema de hidráulico. Lleva un filtro largo adentro del tanque y ese lo recomendamos que lo cambien cada año. También son sedazos donde lleva las mangueras que le dan el aceite a todas las bombas. Hay 2 sedazos, esos no se tienen que cambiar todo el tiempo, pero si por cualquier razón se les llega a joder una bomba o un motor, es recomendable que le saquen el aceite, lo filtren y que mínimo que chequeen los sedazos, reemplazarlos si se ocupan. Todos los números que vean aquí que empiezan con 60, eso van a ser los números de nosotros, esos son los números de las partes para todos los filtros y los sedazos.
All right, next up, charge oil filter. Charge oil filter is located on the side of the engine, on the back on the side of the hydrostat. Looks like a regular oil filter off your car, but it's actually a filter for filtering the charge oil. It's a high pressure filter. When I say high pressure, it's a charge pressure is 375. Kevin will touch on that here in a little bit. But we need to make sure we change this annually. This small filter is responsible for keeping all of the oil clean in the hydrostatic fluid, right? So your ground drive motors, all that is counted on this small filter to keep the oil clean. as the wheel motors reject, or they put some oil out every 1 gallon per minute through lube flushing, the charge pump replenishes that oil in the lube, and it cleans the oil with this filter before it puts in the lube. So it's super important that we change that annually.
Otro filtro de importancia va a ser el filtro que lleva en la bomba detrás de hydrostat, y ese filtro es importante que lo estén cambiando porque es el filtro que le está entrando a la bomba esa. Y esa bomba va a ser para que camine la máquina, ya sea para adelante o para atrás. Ese filtro lo que tiene dos mangueras, y allí usa un sistema para estar jalando el aceite y estar filtrándolo 1 galón por minuto, porque ese sistema es un sistema cerrado. Entre más se filtra el aceite, es mejor.
All right, next up is the air cap filter. This one kind of gets overlooked a lot. So this is a small filter that's located on the firewall, means on the outer firewall of the machine. Its job is basically, we take some air from the air pump that supplies air to the pads. We also pump it into the cap to try to pressurize the cap, right? Doing that, we take that air and we put it through this little filter. That little filter removes the carbon that's created from this air pump. So these vanes are made of carbon. Little bits of carbon come off when that's rotating. This filter removes that carbon, okay? So it's important that we change this annually, so we have, basically, we're pumping fresh air into it. It's often overlooked, but it needs to be done annually. It's a little tiny paper filter, but it's super critical because it does remove the carbon that's created by those vanes.
Otro filtro que tiene la máquina va a ser el filtro del aire que entra a la cabina. En la cabina le está entrando aire mientras esté prendida el motor, le está entrando aire constantemente si tienen almohadillas. Si tienen almohadillas que son sólidas, no va a tener el sistema de aire. Pero el filtro ese está enfrente de la cabina, se le quita la rosca aquí y lleva un filtro de papel. Ese filtro lo que está haciendo es de que por dentro de la bomba del aire, las venas son de carbón. So, está filtrando todo el aire que está entrando para que no esté respirando el carbón.
Right, air filter. This is an easy one, right? Super easy. It's going to sound difficult when hard to accept. So on the machine's equipped with this restriction indicator. It's located right here on the spring. Every machine we manufacture has this restriction indicator. So on the restriction indicator, it'll have this little mark on the side. You can see it, but it says service when red, right? So you're going to look at that. You're going to look at it after it runs and go, and if it's red, you're going to do something super simple. You're going to take this filter apart. You're going to take the filter out of the housing. Anyway, we're going to take the filter out of the housing. We're going to take that filter and we're going to throw it away. We're going to put this filter. And for every 3 of these, we replace the safety filter, all right? That's the process. The thing you got to remember is when you're going to put the new one in, make sure you wipe out the bottom of this so any dirt and dust that's collected in the bottom is cleaned out. If you look on the next couple slides, I'll click there and I'll click back for you. The next couple slides are Donaldson's procedure for replacing the filter, all right? So we're going to run the machine, and then when that restriction indicator tells us it's red, we replace the filter. Any questions? Well, that was a lot easier than I thought it would be.
So, todas las máquinas van a tener un indicador que viene siendo este. El indicador aquí, si se pone rojo, ese es tiempo de cambiar el filtro. Dice que no sopletearlo. Si se pone rojo ahí, lo más simple, cambien el filtro. No lo sopleteen. Por cada 3 filtros que cambien de los grandotes, el filtro de adentro se tiene que cambiar una vez. Cuando abran el sistema para cambiar filtro, lo que van a querer hacer es agarrar una garra mojada, húmeda, y sacarle toda la tierra que lleva por dentro.
Honestly, it varies with conditions. And the only reason I tell you, this is what the manufacturer recommends. I challenge anyone to pull out the market, you search it out. You're not going to find a manufacturer anywhere that recommends you pull this out. I had gentlemen the day out. How much? Right. Yeah. So basically, what happens is people want to blow it out. You know what I mean? I can't recommend. That's not the right way to do it. I know the filters are expensive. I can get microcap to give you a quote on a new engine as well. You know what I mean? So it's expensive, but this we can't recommend you blow it out because the things you'll see too, if you've blown it out before. What you'll notice is when you first run it, and you're going to get those 4 or 5 days you're talking about, and then you blow it out, how long do you get? You're doing that. So really the key to this is to tap them out, yeah. So the key, in my opinion, the key to this is the less we open this, the better off we are. The less chance for mistakes. The less we touch this, the better off we're going to be. And there's some indicators, I don't know what it is, there's a code that's going to come up when we have higher air restriction. 102 on the caps, right? So which is going to indicate that we have that air restriction. But if you wait until that, you're going to be in deep threat, right? Not, the one thing I'll say is, I've seen, the biggest problem I've seen with these is the guys get them on there, they'll put their hand on it or something like that, and they break it, they crash. Sometimes you don't see it, and then it's sucking the air, right? Well, first thing it's going to do is you get a little bit of dust inside of this, you're going to plug up the citric box filter here, and it's never going to breathe. So it's going to sit there, and it doesn't matter what you do, it's there, it doesn't breathe properly. Which renders this useless and fixes it. Right? Yeah, so it's a brand new board now. New benefit, that's 170. But long before you're doing every bit of horsepower, it doesn't take much to end it. You want the filter out there. You've seen people wing nuts and stuff like that where you leave the wing nut off and you can be done in way more tolerant to guts. You know what I mean? The new engines are hungry. If I'm not mistaken, draws 450 CFM a barrel. So I mean, it's air hungry with the twin turbines. I mean, it's drawing so much air into there, and it just keeps pulling it in. So it will eat that in a hurry. It's one of the old engines were naturally aspirated. We didn't have that kind of airflow demand. But the new engines, the twin turbo stuff like that, you're drawing so much more air into that system in order to bring that. Anyway, yeah, you need to inspect it to make sure it's not cracked. And they actually put in these cracks. And sometimes it's just in the wrong spot. A lot of times when you're flying around the machine or something like that. But yeah, that can happen. So, and so a good way to just check that too is like if it never changes, you know, there's a little thing on there that says it's a water restriction. If it never changes, you know it's not.
Algo que preguntó fue que cuánto más o menos dura un filtro, y el filtro va a depender mucho en el film, porque hay files que tienen más polvo que otros. Algo que nosotros recomendamos es que entre menos abran el sistema es mejor, porque hay menos posibilidad de que entre tierra. Nosotros también no recomendamos de que someter el filtro. Si aquí marca rojo, es tiempo de cambiar el filtro. Algo que también que van a querer chequear es que este esté jalando bien. Si está quebrado por cualquier razón, hay que cambiarlo. Al tiempo de cambiarlo, aquí donde se enchufa al indicador, lleva un sedazo de bronce. Si ese bronce está tapado, no, tampoco nunca va a marcar el indicador. So, hay que chequear bien que todo el sistema esté correcto.
On that same note, I just pulled the cap off the back of this air cleaner. I don't know if you guys can see it, but right inside here, this is an old sintered bronze filter. This thing's broken, this thing's locked. Theoretically, we're going to try to draw that 450 CFM with that first, and it's going to stop the dirt from going in. But it's also going to plug up in a hurry. Next thing you know, that canister's even actually worthless at that point, as far as reading the air restriction.
Atrás de aquí, de donde van los filtros, se mira el sedazo de bronce. Si ese se llega a tapar, ya no va a leer, o si se llega a quebrar, por fuera, lo que va a pasar es que va a chupar todo el polvo y todo lo que hay en el aire, y lo va a chupar el motor.
Any other questions on the air filters?
¿Preguntas en los filtros de aire?
All right, we're going to talk about the limitations.
Buena cuestión.
Right.
Usualmente cuando ese no se quiebra, lo que pasa es de que se tapan, y al tiempo de taparse, ya no le va a estar leyendo. Si están viendo que la marca roja aquí no se está moviendo para nada, sugerimos que chequen el bronce, que no esté tapado, o que esté trabajando bien el indicador. Well, he asked if, how do you know if the screen in here is ripped or broken? And I told him the only way of really knowing is if it gets plugged up and then the indicator is no longer going to work. If you notice your indicator isn't working for a few days, there's something wrong, and chances are it's either the screen or the indicator.
Thank you, Ricky. All right. Anybody else? We'll talk about lubrication. We kind of talked about the shake your head already, the 3 spots. Grease it, grease it, grease it. That's kind of the theme I have for this whole slide. Grease it, grease it, grease it. All right. We talked about we talked about the wheel motors and the lubrication of that. So this is actually straight out of the owner's manual as well. All right. So the other spots that we have to talk about greasing, the caster rings and the steering cylinder. So both into the steering cylinder, the caster rings. There's a grease circ on top and a grease circ on the bottom. We need to make sure that we're greasing those daily as well. All right. The ones on the tilt and roll, we need to make sure we grease those too. We need to grease them, grease them, grease them. There's grease circs here for the roll. You'll see after a while, when people don't grease it, they go to try to roll it and the thing's stuck. Next thing you know, you're pushing the head down on the ground, trying to get it to roll up flat. If it's already at that point, you've already done some damage in there, you're just going to need to keep greasing it, or at some point you have to cut it apart and replace it. Chief insurance is grease it, grease it, grease it. Once again, no seals to blow out or anything right here. Grease it, rotate it a little bit, grease it some more, put it in a different position, grease it more. The one on the bottom here is a pain in the butt to get to, along with the one on the bottom of that tilt set on the lift, right? But you need to make sure you grease it, grease it, grease it. I just saw a picture of one the other day where this tube had cracked and it was dry, and basically we're going to snap it apart. You're going to put all that pressure on there trying to lift it or going down, and it's not greased. Things are going to happen. Grease it, grease it, grease it. If you're running 2 shifts, grease it before each shift. Grease it, grease it, grease it.
Este diagrama es parte del libro que viene con la máquina, y aquí te va a enseñar y te va a decir de cambiar aceites en los hubs, que ya vamos a hacer rato. También te va a enseñar dónde están todos los puntos de grasa, todas las graseras. Algo que no vamos a hacer rato fueron 2 graseras que van enfrente en la llanta, donde cuando da vuelta la llanta lleva una arriba y una abajo. En el cilindro lleva una en cada lado del cilindro. En la cabeza, en el boom, ese también le van a querer echar bastante grasa. No tiene sellos o no van a poner ningún sello. Por abajo lleva 3 graseras y hasta que no le salga la grasa. Donde borneen la cabeza, asegúrense que tengan bastante grasa. Una de las cosas que nos hablan es de que le dan para un lado la cabeza y ya la cabeza no se quiere regresar o no quiere voltear por otro lado. la mayoría de las veces es falta de grasa. So, no, ahí no le pueden echar bastante grasa, échenle bastante grasa. Si no le echan grasa, lo que va a pasar es de que la soldadura de aquí se va a craquear y entonces vamos a tener que reemplazar todo.
Alright. Next slide just kind of goes over some of the service intervals that Alan covered in the engines, and the other ones we covered, so it's kind of a reference sheet for that. On the bottom, there's 3 other things that are added to it: tire pressure, lug nut torque, and then the amount of freon. The amount of freon in this indicated for the sprint, it varies slightly from machine to machine, but it's fairly accurate.
So, aquí está un diagrama de las horas a las que tienes que serviciar el motor, 250. Todas las máquinas van a ser un poco diferentes, depende del motor. Te va a decir qué tipo de aceite llevan. También acá abajo va a decir, te dice que las llantas llevan 40 libras de presión, son 186 para los libros de las llantas, y mayormente las máquinas llevan 2.5 libras de freon para el aire acondicionado.
Any questions on that section?
Preguntas. Las graseras se van a engrasar mínimo una vez por turno. O si tienen 2 turnos, va a ser 2 veces, pero mínimo una vez por turno. He asked how often you should grease all the grease fittings. Sí. Cuando torquean el tornillo, lo que van a querer hacer es poner una llave por abajo. Y lo que hacemos nosotros es que usamos la parte que no está abierta, y al revés, o lo que se va a hacer es se va a atorar en la parte de abajo, y para que no dé vueltas para poderle torquear bien. He asked about the torque on the energy wheel pin. He said that they try to torque it and it spins from the bottom. I just told him just get a wrench underneath and hold it. That way it doesn't. That way the whole bolt doesn't turn.
Para las demás graseras, ¿hay algún tipo de grasa especial que tengas que usar? Porque algunas grasas que se usan se salen rápido. ¿Alguna que recomienden?
Esa es una de las cosas de que cualquier grasa ahí, porque de todos modos es un lugar donde sí ocupa grasa y ocupa mucha grasa, pero por lo mismo no quiere una grasa que sea muy cara y está gastando grasa. El tornillo ese se cambia cada vez que se reemplaza cualquier cosa ahí o que se quiebre. So he asked how often you change the energy wheel pin, and that's we do it every time we change anything internal on the bearings itself.
All right, we're going to move on to the hydraulic system here. I think we're gonna shoot for lunch right about 12. So all right, here's Kevin with some hydraulic development.
Alright, I'll cover the 3 basic hydraulic systems on our machine. We got our main hydraulic system, which is going to be cut in 2 pieces: your auxiliary circuit and then also your drive circuit. This decal right here, Alan's actually my hand model. This decal is on this door. This decal right here is very beneficial to you and us. If you have a problem on us to help you troubleshoot over the phone, we're going to have you look at this decal to be able to identify where these parts are. This kind of gives you a basic idea of where the parts are in the hydraulic part.
So, una cosa de lo que vamos a estar cubriendo va a ser todo lo hidráulico. So, en todas las máquinas, las Springs, llevan una calcomanía y esa calcomanía te va a indicar todas las partes y qué función tienen. Algo muy importante es de que si nos hablan por un problema, es más fácil para nosotros ayudarles en el teléfono y a ver si podemos resolver el problema sin nosotros tener que ir. Te va a indicar todas las secciones y para qué son.
First one, this circuit, the way it was, it comes out of the low sense pump, goes into your PVG, which is this part right here. Comes into your inlet section, and then this part is just your 32 sections. So on your 32s, you have your sweeper lift, your in and out, your roll, and your boom. Each one of these has its own pressure, which I'll go over in a second.
Uno de los circuitos que tiene la máquina de hidráulico va a ser el circuito de sale de la pompa y entra a la válvula grande. Y la válvula grande está dividida entre dos, tiene el lado 32 y el lado 120. El lado 32 va a ser para levantar las barredoras, para meter y sacar la cabeza, para levantar la cabeza y para rodar, para que ruede la cabeza, para ponerla.
So your in and out pressure is 1800 psi, your boom pressure is going to be 2500 psi, your roll is going to be 2200 psi, and your sweeper lift is 500 psi. Also, each one of these functions has a manual actuator. So if you call me and you ask, say, hey, my in and out cylinder is dead, what I'm going to have you do is go out to the machine and actually manually actuate this. It's going to, so if it moves, it's going to tell me you got an electrical problem. If it doesn't, it's going to tell me you have a hydraulic problem. However, when you do that, that's going to cause something to move. If you're standing where Alan's standing and you hit the roll or something, it could possibly put your leg in there. You're not paying attention and you push the boom down and your feet and someone else's feet are underneath it, you're going to smash it. It's very important when you pull one of these functions that you're aware of what's around you, just to make sure no one gets hurt.
So, algo en el circuito, todo depende de la función que vayas a usar, es la presión que va a tener. So, para sacar y meter la cabeza, la presión son de 1800. Para rodar la cabeza son 2200. Para levantar la cabeza van a ser 2500. Algo que también pueden hacer es de que en la válvula, aquí abajo, le pueden meter una llave de 9 milímetros y le pueden jalar una función con la máquina prendida. Pero al hacer eso tienen que tener mucho cuidado porque si le jalan a una palanca, una de las funciones va a jalar. Y si están en el lugar equivocado, lo que puede pasar es de que se pueden lastimar, que se les pueda caer la cabeza encima o lastimarse.
Any questions on that?
Preguntas.
Alright, this is the shake circuit, which is the other half of our main circuit. Oil, same thing, comes from the low sense pump, goes to the PVG. This is actually your 32 section, or I'm sorry, your 120 side. So what happens with this is if you hit your clamp shake button, it goes, it starts clamping as soon as it hits your clamp pressure, which should be in between 800 and 1500 psi. It'll hit that. You'll see your system pressure spike up to 3 grams, which is to get your wheels spinning, and then while it's shaking, it'll drop down to 2000 psi. This is basically how this whole shake circuit works.
Otro circuito que tiene en el sistema hidráulico es el circuito de para sacudir. So, lo que pasa es de que sale la presión de la bomba, entra a la válvula grande, a la 120, y lo que pasa ahí es de que cuando le detienes el botón, lo que va a pasar es que la presión va a subir a 3000 por un segundo, nomás para empezar a que den vueltas las ruedas. Ya empezando a sacudir y de que estén dando vueltas las ruedas, entonces la presión va a bajar a 2000.
Alright, so the pressure for the main circuit, you're going to be running at 3000 psi. That is right here in the section. This one first. Where you adjust your clamp pressure is right behind the driver's seat. So Right here, you have a 9/16 nut and an out. You're going to want to go in for more pressure and out for less pressure. On here, you have your sequence pressure, which is right here, which should be set at 2,000, which is the same way as adjusting your clamp pressure, in for more and out for less. You have your counterbalance cartridge, and this is your This is what is causing that head belt to stop shaking. Like Brian said earlier, if you adjust that too hard in, when you go to stop that belt, what happens is it'll kick back so hard, it'll come off the top wheel and it'll cause you to throw your belt.
So, en el sistema para sacudir, para ajustarle la presión de la tijera, va a ser adentro de la cabina, detrás del hombro derecho de uno. Y para ajustar eso, agarra una llave 916 y una M. Dependiendo de la presión, acuérdense, esa tiene que estar entre 800 a 1500. Y para ajustarle, le aflojan la tuerca. Y si meten el tornillo para adentro, es más presión. Y si lo sacan, es menos presión. Lo que pasa es que cuando llega la presión que escogiste, entra toda la presión al bloque este. En el bloque este hay cartuchos de secuencia que vienen siendo este. Ese es el de sube momentáneamente de 3000 y baja a 2000. Y luego está la breca grande. La breca esta es la breca de la cabeza. Ese es que tan rápido va a parar de sacudir cuando le sueltan el botón. Al ajustar esa, no la quieren que sea muy rápido, porque lo que va a pasar es que van a empezar a escupir la banda.
Any questions?
Preguntas.
All right, next circuit is the ground drive. The way this one goes is you have your hydrostat, which is basically supplying 4,600 PSI to those wheel motors. These wheel motors have a lube flushing valve in there, which lets 1 gallon per wheel motor go back to tank, which then allows fresh oil to come back in and cool down the system. Also inside the hydrostat, you have a charge pump. When you start that machine, it sends 375 PSI to this brake to disengage it. That's why when that machine's off, you can't really move it unless you hit a hub. That's because that brake is completely locked on.
Otro circuito de la máquina va a ser el del manejo, que sea para adelante o para atrás. Saliendo la bomba, son 4,600 libras de presión que tiene el sistema, y también tiene incluido el sistema donde va a desaguarse el aceite para regresarse al tanque para mantenerlo más frío. En ese mismo sistema está un cartucho que hace que se desactiven las brecas. So, ese va a ser 375 libras.
So now, if you were to call one of the service managers or someone that said you had a problem with your brake dragging or your machine's locked up, what I'm going to have you do is go to where your charge pump filter is and put a gauge on it. Tell you to start it and read what the pressure is. If it's 375, then we have a different issue. If it's lower than 375, we have to figure out what's going on and why that pressure is dropping. That's what's going to cause that brake to lock up.
Una de las cosas de las que nos hablan mucho también es de las brecas no se están desactivando, no están soltando. Lo que primero que le vamos a decir, atrás en la bomba donde está el filtro, lleva 2 líneas. Ahí le van a meter un gauge y ahí tiene que leer 375, no más. Y si es menos, tenemos que ver qué es lo que está causando que sea menos.
One last thing on this slide. These hoses are 4-wire hoses. If you blow on or something happens to one of your hoses, you want to make sure you replace that hose with the same size hose. That's a lot of pressure. You don't want to replace it with a less hose.
Otra cosa es de que en las mangueras que están en la bomba llevan 4,600 libras de presión. Si se les llega a reventar una línea por cualquier razón, asegúrense de reemplazarlas con mangueras que sean de 4 alambres, porque si son de 2 alambres, lo que va a pasar es que se van a reventar las mangueras.
All right, this is the last circuit. This is our auxiliary circuit. Your auxiliary pump is actually located on the back side of the engine, so on the back flip down. Where the oil comes out of this one is it comes out of the pump, goes to the steering motor, comes off the steering motor, goes to the flow divider for the reversing fan, also the flow divider for the air pump, and then goes back to tank.
El último circuito que tiene la máquina va a ser el circuito para manejar la máquina, para darle vuelta a la máquina. So, lo que va a pasar es de que va a salir la presión de la pompa y al primero que le va a entrar va a ser al volante. Del volante sale la presión y entra la presión a un cartucho donde divide la presión para la bomba de aire y también para el abanico del motor, para que se reversible para aventar la basura.
Okay, your steering pressure is going to be right about 1,300 psi. Coming off that, going to the reversing fan, you're going to have a gauge. That gauge should always be reading 600. That gauge is right here, and it'll be on the back wall, pretty much right on the opposite side of the water tank. This waterman is basically what turns off and on that fan. And then our air pump, which is this right here, we don't actually set with a pressure. This is actually set with a piece of reflective tape in a tap. And it should be set to 1,300 RPM.
So, algo más del circuito ese es de que cuando entra la presión al volante va a entrar la presión a 1,800 libras. Saliendo de ahí, tiene que estar en la válvula esta, y mientras esté prendida la máquina, este gauge tiene que estar leyendo 600 libras. De esta válvula sale la presión para otro cartucho, y este cartucho de aquí viene siendo para los abanicos, para el abanico del motor. Este es para que se reversible el abanico, las aspas. Y de ahí también se divide y entra a la bomba. So, para la pompa del aire, lo que ahí no se regula la presión, lo que se va a regular va a ser las revoluciones de la bomba, y ahí se van a hacer a 1,300 revoluciones.
Any questions?
Preguntas.
All right, we're going to break for lunch.
It's better than zero. Yeah, everyone will be doing the raffle right after this. All right, we're just going to go over some wire safety, and just be mindful of just any damaged or exposed wires. But it can get inside some of these harnesses, so if you do see an exposed or broken wire, if you want, go ahead and electrically tape it up. If not, one of our service providers can provide you with a new harness. If you do decide to repair it yourself, just please disconnect the battery. Just makes it easy and safe for you.
Algo que tienen que recordarse de las máquinas es porque andan en los files, también hay posibilidad que se metan ratones o cualquier cosa a morder los alambres. O si van a trabajar en la máquina en cualquier circuito de electricidad, lo que van a querer es desconectar la batería primero.
If you guys do decide to weld on your machine, please disconnect the battery and please disconnect the engine's computer connector. It's always going to be the biggest one running because it's the back of the engine.
También, si tienen que soldar en la máquina por cualquier razón, asegúrense de desconectar la batería, y también asegúrense de desconectar la prueba que va a la computadora para el motor.
This is mostly to avoid any high voltages from welding going back into your computer and frying it out.
Este es para prevenir que la electricidad que cuando está soldando uno se regrese y dañe la computadora.
Fuses, this is an example of the Sprint's fuses. Underneath the armrest where you're at the Sprint, you'll have the fuse diagram, as well as you'll be able to see the fuses.
En las máquinas, en la Sprint, debajo de donde pone uno el brazo, está el diagrama de los fusibles, de uno de los fusibles, y así se mira.
It's also pretty important, if a fuse does blow, please replace it with the same amp rating that it was.
Y es muy importante de que si se les daña uno de los fusibles y lo tienen que reemplazar, que se reemplace con el fusible de los amperes que le quitaron.
I know a lot of dust can also build up right there in the armrest, so if that's starting to pile up, just give it a quick blow off.
Y por lo mismo que andan en la tierra, en el polvo, sabemos que se llena mucho de polvo, solo que van a querer es darle una sopleteada de vez en cuando.
Again, I think Brian went over this, but you guys can see the black electrical box. I want to point to that back there. Just don't directly power wash it. It's alright if it gets wet, just no power washing.
So, acá atrás está un panel donde está todo de lo eléctrico del motor. So, es importante de que si se moja está bien, pero no le dé con la cuestión.
Alright, we're going to go over some display settings. Sorry, this is a bad picture, but in the display, if you actually hit the right arrow, hold that down for about 2 seconds, it's going to pop up all the systems and either show green, that's connected and working, or red, that's broken and not communicating.
Con la pantalla, si pican el botón para la derecha, les va a salir esta pantalla. No se mira muy bien, pero en esa pantalla todo va a ser o verde o rojo. Si está rojo no está jalando, algo está mal. Y si está verde significa que todo está bien.
If you are using our Telematics system, it's a good system because it logs all your, not only your engine faults, but also the sprint faults that are specific to us. I think we're all familiar with ghost faults. You know, it was broken now, and now when you got here, it's working fine. So our Telematics will actually log any faults. They'll tell us the date and the time and how many times that fault occurred.
So, uno de los sistemas que tenemos es como el sistema de GPS, y ese sistema nos deja saber si le sale un código y nos hablan y nosotros vamos y el código ya no está. De todos modos nosotros podemos sacar ese código y saber a qué horas pasó, cuántas veces pasó y todo lo que ocasiona ese código.
Any questions so far?
Preguntas.
Alright, we're just going to go over some basic display functions. Let's go over to the first page. We have to show this warning at the beginning of startup. The machine will not run or do any implements until you accept this warning.
So, cuando de primero prenda la máquina, los que le va a salir es esta pantalla y la máquina no se va a mover, no va a tener ninguna función, menos hasta que le piquen al botón para aceptarlo.
I think we're all familiar with the sprint display. Obviously, depending on your machine, you can either have dual water, either the tree seeker system, turn the laser on. These are separated into 2 pages. You'll have all your main functions on the first page, and it will always display your engine information as well. And then on the second page, it'll also show your secondary implements.
So, en las pantallas, la primera pantalla tiene 2 pantallas. La primera pantalla te va a decir cómo va a tener para seleccionar, para prender el agua, las luces de alta o baja velocidad y el escoger el tamaño del árbol.
Just an example of the second page.
Y ese es un ejemplo de la segunda página.
Our sprint will always display faults depending if it's a critical fault or just a warning. It will always pop up on the top of the screen. If it's red, it's critical, and if it's yellow, it's a warning.
Son las máquinas en las sprints. Si les llega a salir algo en la máquina, un código en la máquina va a salir rojo, y eso significa que el problema es crítico.
And this will automatically pop up, so if you're already aware of this, it might be kind of annoying to see it keep popping up, so you can just press the X button, and the pop-ups will stop until the next key cycle.
So, si prende la máquina y le está saliendo ese código y la máquina sigue funcionando bien, lo que pueden hacer es picarle a la X y se va a quitar el código, ya no les va a salir el código hasta que vuelvan a prender la máquina otra vez.
This is just what the warning looks like.
Y este es el amarillo que no es tan crítico.
Like a car's OBD2 fault checker diagnostic tool, the Sprint actually has its own engine faults and engine checker built into it. Right off the bat, this would be good for any Caterpillar technician or any Cummins technician or to explain what's going on with your engine. If you do have a critical engine fault, this page will automatically be brought up at the beginning of the key cycle. You don't have to know your SPNs and FMIs, all those codes and stuff. We went ahead and translated that stuff for you guys. It'll tell you what's wrong and then what's specifically wrong with the engine.
So, si les llega a salir esta pantalla te está indicando que hay algún código en el motor. No necesario, si le sale un número, la mayormente te va a decir qué fue el código y qué está ocasionando el código.
What's nice too is you're also able to delete all the faults if you think you corrected it yourself.
So, si ustedes piensan que arreglaron la máquina o la arreglaron la máquina, pueden borrar esos códigos ahí.
Alright, we're just going to go through some of these setting pages here. Right off the bat, we're going to look at the shake settings, cruise settings, and like your fan and water too.
Aquí está la página de ajuste, aquí se ajusta el abanico, el tiempo y el día y una de las de los modos de sacudir de la cabeza.
You can go ahead and get to the setting pages from the main display. Obviously, just a settings, click it, it'll come up to this page. This is just another example of what the shake settings looks like, what you can adjust.
Aquí está otro ejemplo de los ajustes que se pueden hacer para sacudir la máquina y diferentes modos.
Yeah. That'll be coming up here pretty soon.
Apenas hoy no las 7.
Sí lo van a hacer. Todavía no hay, pero sí lo van a hacer.
Kind of what you asked, the way you do is one of these sections is going to be highlighted, and it's simple. You just move the arrows to kind of adjust where you want that time to be, and then up and down to increase or decrease that time.
Aquí es una de las maneras que se pueden ajustar el chequeo. So, ahí para navegar van a usar los botones acá abajo y ya ustedes van a subir los segundos o bajarle los segundos, dependiendo del tamaño del árbol.
And also depending on the tree you're shaking, either it's a small, medium, or large tree, we just separate it into 3 categories. You can go ahead and adjust the settings for each one, and then your operator can choose what they're going to shake, their small, medium, or large tree.
O le pueden poner cualquier ajuste que quieran, dependiendo del árbol, si sea pequeño, mediano, grande, y ya en la primera pantalla se le puede cambiar al árbol que van a estar sacudiendo.
So this is just the shake time settings page. Another example is like the engine speed settings page. So again, you can set your RPMs depending on your tree size.
So, otro ajuste es del tiempo que va a sacudir el árbol y también las revoluciones del motor cuando está sacudiendo el árbol.
And another example is just the variable frequency settings too, just for how fast you want your RPM and how quickly you want it to shake.
También otro ajuste es porque tiene un programa de variedad para cuando está sacudiendo y ahí se puede ajustar en esa página.
I think Brian kind of already went over this too, and these are just your water settings. Some of you guys might not have water pads, but it will still show. But you can go ahead and adjust your water time settings kind of the same way.
Aquí está los ajustes del agua, ya sea para el tanque de lubricación para las almohadillas o las que entran adentro de las almohadillas. No lo tiene de todos modos, va a estar ahí, pero no lo van a poder ajustar.
And just again for your set throttle settings as well.
Y para que se revolucione solo también, ahí pueden moverle.
And of course your fan reverse time too. We actually also increased how many seconds you can now keep it on. It went from 5, so now you can have it up to 10 seconds of it pushing air back.
Aquí es la página del ajuste del abanico, so ahí se va a poner el tiempo de qué tanto tiempo quieres que se reverse el abanico y por cuánto tiempo también.
And finally, this is going to go ahead and show you what you or your operator, how many tree shakes they did in a day or in a season. It can easily be resettable.
So, lo último es la cuenta de cuántos árboles chequearon o cuántas veces sacudió la máquina.
Any questions?
Preguntas.
All set.
Take it. All right.
Sigue la rifa.
Go.
All right. We'll get started here in a second. I'm going to need a bunch of